My name is Rachel Simmons, and I'm 34 years old. For most of my life, I believed that family meant loyalty. I believed that no matter how far apart we lived or how different our paths became, blood was supposed to mean something. I learned the hard way that for some people, blood only matters when it's useful to them. This is the story of how my own parents forged my signature, sold the house I inherited from my late husband, and used the money to fund my younger brother's extravagant wedding, all while I was working overseas, completely unaware that the roof over my future had been sold out from under me. But this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's a story about what happens when you finally stop being the family doormat and start fighting back with everything the law allows. If you've ever been the responsible one in your family, the one who got the calls when there was a problem, but never the invitation when there was a celebration, stay until the end, because what I did next changed everything. 3 years ago, my husband David died in a car accident. He was 36. We had been married for 6 years, and in that short time, we built a life together in a quiet suburb outside Manchester, England, a modest 3-bedroom house with a garden David had planted himself, roses along the fence, and a small oak tree we put in the year we got married. That house wasn't just property. It was the last physical piece of him I had left. Every room held a memory. The kitchen where he burned toast every single morning. The bedroom window where he'd watch the sunrise before his early shifts. The garden where I scattered some of his ashes because he always said he wanted to stay close to home. After David passed, I inherited the house outright. No mortgage, fully paid off from his life insurance and our joint savings. It was mine, legally and emotionally. I couldn't bring myself to sell it, even though grief made it hard to stay there some nights. Instead, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I took a job assignment in Dubai, working as a project manager for an international logistics firm. The pay was excellent, the experience was invaluable, and honestly, I needed the distance. I needed to breathe somewhere that didn't remind me of David every time I opened a cupboard. Before I left, I did what I thought was a responsible, trusting thing. I asked my parents, Linda and Gerald, if they could keep an eye on the house while I was gone. Check the mail, make sure the pipes didn't freeze in winter, mow the lawn occasionally. I gave them a spare key. I did not give them power of attorney. I did not give them permission to make decisions about the property. I certainly never gave them permission to sell it. My parents live about 40 minutes from that house, in the same town where I grew up. My younger brother, Kevin, 29 at the time, had always been the golden child. He was charming, effortlessly likable, and had a habit of stumbling from one financial mess to another, while somehow always landing on his feet, usually because our parents caught him. I loved my brother. I want to be honest about that, because this story isn't about hating him. It's about what desperation and favoritism can turn ordinary people into. Kevin got engaged to his girlfriend, Priya, about 18 months after David died. I was happy for him. I sent a card, I called to congratulate them, and I mentioned that once I got settled back from my contract, I'd love to help with the wedding in whatever way I could. What I didn't know was that helping with the wedding had already been decided for me. I just wasn't told about it. Looking back now, there were signs. My mother's phone calls became less frequent, and when we did talk, the conversations felt scripted, surface level. She'd ask about the weather in Dubai, about my job, but she'd steer away from any topic involving the house or Kevin's wedding plans. When I offered to video call and see how the garden was doing, she always had an excuse. The signal's bad today. Your father's not feeling well. Let's do it another time. I chalked it up to normal parental awkwardness. My mother was never great at video calls anyway. I was thousands of miles away, buried in 80-hour work weeks, trying to rebuild a sense of purpose after losing my husband. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to suspect my own parents of something sinister. Who would? You don't expect the people who raised you to become the architects of your undoing. About 10 months before I found out the truth, my mother mentioned, almost too casually, that Kevin and Priya were planning a big wedding, something with a marquee, a live band, a destination-style reception even though it would be held locally. custom invitations flown in from a specialty printer in Italy. I remember thinking, that sounds expensive, and wondering how a junior sales associate and a part-time yoga instructor were affording something so lavish. I asked my mother about it directly. She laughed it off and said, "Oh, you know your father and I are helping out. Don't worry about it." I should have asked more questions. I didn't, because I trusted them. The call came on a Tuesday evening, Dubai time. It was a neighbor of mine from back home, an elderly woman named Mrs. Whitfield, who had lived next to David and me since we first bought the house. She called to ask, quite innocently, how the new family was settling in. I remember standing in my apartment kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, completely confused. "What new family, Mrs. Whitfield?" She hesitated, and I could hear the concern creeping into her voice. "The couple who moved in about 4 months ago, dear. Nice young pair." I assumed you knew. I saw the sold sign go up outside back in the spring. I felt my stomach drop through the floor. I asked her to repeat herself, certain I had misheard. She hadn't misspoken. My house, David's house, our house, had a sold sign outside it months earlier, and new tenants had already moved in and settled in as if it had always been theirs. I hung up the phone and immediately called my mother. She didn't pick up. I called again. Straight to voicemail. I called my father. Same thing. Someone had sold my house. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I did what any reasonable, methodical person would do when their world starts collapsing. I started gathering evidence. I logged into the UK Land Registry website and paid for an official title register document for the property. The property had indeed been sold. A transfer of ownership had gone through a licensed solicitor's office, dated roughly 5 months earlier, for a sum well below market value, to a young couple who, it turned out, were friends of a friend of my parents. I never signed anything. I never received a single penny from that transaction. I contacted the solicitor's firm listed on the transfer documentation the next morning, my time zone making it the middle of the night in the UK, so I had to wait several agonizing hours for their offices to open. When I finally got through, I explained who I was and asked for details on the sale. The woman on the phone, to her credit, immediately sensed something was wrong when I told her I had been in Dubai the entire time and had never once stepped into her office. She pulled the file. The client who had come in, presented as Rachel Simmons, provided identification and signed the transfer documents, was not me. The Marquis. Everything he deserved. Paid for with my trust. I wasn't going to cry this one out. I was going to fight it out. I booked a flight back to Manchester within 48 hours. I told my company I had a family emergency, which was, if anything, an understatement. I didn't call my parents to tell them I was coming. I didn't want them to have time to prepare a story, hide documents, or coach Kevin on what to say. The flight felt like the longest 7 hours of my life. I spent it drafting, in a notebook, every single question I intended to ask, every piece of evidence I had already gathered, and a rough outline of what I needed to do the moment I landed: file a police report for fraud and forgery, contact a solicitor specializing in property and family law, and request an emergency freeze on any further transactions related to the stolen funds if possible. I landed at Manchester Airport on a grey, drizzling morning that felt fitting. I didn't go to a hotel. I went straight to my parents' house, dragging my suitcase up the same driveway I had walked 100 times as a child, feeling like a stranger in a place that used to feel like home. My mother opened the door. Her face went white. "Rachel," she said, her voice cracking. "We didn't know you were. Why didn't you call?" "Why didn't you call me," I said, "when you were forging my signature and selling my house?" I won't pretend that conversation was calm. It wasn't. My mother cried, immediately reaching for excuses. She said they always intended to tell me eventually. She said they knew I would say no if they asked, so they didn't ask. She said Kevin needed help, that his wedding was important, that I was doing fine on my own and didn't need the house as much as he needed the money. My father was worse. He didn't cry. He got defensive, almost indignant, as though I was the one who had done something wrong by finding out. He said things like, "You weren't even living there," and "David's gone, Rachel. You need to move on," and the sentence that I will never forget as long as I live: "Family helps family." That's what the house was for. That's what the house was for. As if David's death, as if my grief, as if my late husband's memory existed as a resource to be liquidated for my brother's convenience. I asked to speak to Kevin. He came downstairs sheepishly, unable to look me in the eye at first. When I asked him directly whether he knew the wedding money had come from selling my house, he admitted he knew. He said he assumed I was okay with it because our parents told him I had agreed to help out. He knew that was a lie. He had seen enough of how our parents operated over the years to know better, but he took the money anyway because it built him the wedding of his dreams. I told all three of them, calmly, that I would be pursuing legal action. My mother begged me to reconsider, saying it would tear the family apart. I told her the family had already been torn apart by her in a solicitor's office 5 months earlier. The next morning, I filed a report with Greater Manchester Police, providing the land registry documents, the solicitor's confirmation of identity discrepancies, and the timeline of events. Fraud and forgery of legal documents, especially involving property transfer, is a serious criminal offense in the UK, and the officer who took my statement didn't sugarcoat how serious this was. Forgery under the Fraud Act, along with fraud by false representation, can carry significant custodial sentences, particularly when the sums involved are this substantial. I also retained a solicitor specializing in property fraud and family disputes. She was clear-eyed and direct with me from our very first meeting. Because the house had already been sold to a third party, the young couple who now lived there, reversing the sale entirely would be extremely difficult, especially if they had purchased in good faith without knowledge of the fraud. However, she explained that I had strong civil grounds to pursue my parents directly for damages, essentially suing them for the value of what they had stolen, plus potential additional damages for the emotional distress and loss caused by the fraudulent sale of a property tied to my husband's estate. We moved forward on 2 fronts simultaneously: the criminal fraud investigation through the police and a civil claim against my parents for the recovery of funds. I want to take a moment here because this part matters. The young couple living in my house, David's house, had done nothing wrong. They had purchased the property through what appeared to be a completely legitimate transaction, with a licensed solicitor overseeing the sale, proper paperwork, and a price that, while lower than market value, wasn't so absurdly low that it would have raised obvious red flags to buyers with no reason to suspect fraud. I met with them once the initial shock had worn off enough for me to think clearly. It was an emotional conversation. I explained everything. They were horrified and, honestly, deeply sympathetic. They had no idea the sale had been fraudulent, and legally, because they were bona fide purchasers. My solicitor confirmed that pursuing them to reclaim the physical house was unlikely to succeed and would cause undue harm to innocent people who had done nothing but trust a paperwork process that had been corrupted before it ever reached them. I made peace with that. The house, physically, was gone. But the accountability for what happened to it was not. The investigation took the better part of a year. The solicitor's firm cooperated fully, providing copies of the falsified identification my mother had used, a cheap, poorly made fake driving license with my name and her photograph, which honestly, in hindsight, should never have passed any reasonable verification check. That failure became its own point of concern, and the solicitor's firm ended up facing scrutiny from their regulatory body for inadequate identity verification procedures. Small comfort, but a consequence nonetheless. My mother was charged with fraud by false representation and forgery. My father was charged as an accessory, since evidence showed he had helped coordinate the fake documentation and had directly benefited from the proceeds. Kevin was not criminally charged. He hadn't personally forged anything or misrepresented himself to the solicitor, but he was named as a defendant in my civil suit, since he had knowingly received and spent stolen funds. The criminal case moved through the court slowly, as these things do. My mother ultimately pleaded guilty to reduce her sentencing exposure, receiving a suspended prison sentence along with a criminal record that will follow her for the rest of her life. My father was found guilty as an accessory and received a similar suspended sentence with community service. Neither of them went to prison, which initially frustrated me, but my solicitor helped me understand that first-time offenders in their 60s, without prior criminal history, rarely receive custodial sentences for this type of offense, even when the harm caused is severe. The suspended sentence meant that any further offense of any kind would trigger immediate imprisonment. It also meant a permanent criminal record, which affected my father's ability to continue in his part-time consulting work and my mother's volunteer positions at her church, both of which required background checks. The civil case was where I found real, tangible justice. The court ordered my parents and Kevin, jointly, to repay the full value of the stolen proceeds, plus interest, plus a portion of my legal fees. It took time to enforce. My parents didn't have the money sitting around, obviously, since it had all gone toward a wedding, so a portion of it came through a court-ordered charge against their own home, meaning if they ever sell it, I get paid first. Kevin, to his credit, sold his car and took out a personal loan to pay his share rather than drag the process out further, which was the first genuinely responsible thing I'd seen him do in this entire ordeal. People often ask me if I've forgiven my parents. It's a complicated question, and I don't think the answer is a simple yes or no. I don't speak to my mother regularly. We exchange occasional messages around holidays, stilted and formal, nothing like the relationship we once had. My father and I haven't spoken since the sentencing hearing. I don't know if that will change, and, honestly, I've made peace with the possibility that it won't. Kevin and I have a strange, tentative relationship now. He reached out about 8 months after everything settled, genuinely remorseful, acknowledging that he took the easy path instead of the right one. We've had a few conversations since. I don't fully trust him yet, and I'm not sure I ever will completely, but I appreciate that he didn't run from accountability once it caught up with him. As for the house, David's house, I've let it go, in the way you let go of something you can never get back. I used part of the settlement money to buy a smaller property back in Manchester, somewhere new, somewhere without those specific memories attached to every corner. It's not the same. It will never be the same. But it's mine, legally, undeniably, with paperwork I control and a key that only I hold. If there's one thing I want people watching this to understand, it's that family loyalty should never be a one-way obligation. Being the responsible one, the one who doesn't cause problems, the one who's expected to sacrifice quietly for everyone else's convenience, is not a role you owe anyone. Love does not require you to accept betrayal in silence, and blood does not entitle anyone to what is legally and rightfully yours. If something ever feels off with people you trust, vague answers, avoided calls, sudden financial windfalls you can't explain, trust that instinct. Ask the uncomfortable questions. Check the paperwork. I wish I had asked more questions sooner. I wish I hadn't assumed that trust between parent and child was automatically mutual. It cost me a piece of my late husband I can never get back. But I also want you to know this. It is possible to fight back. It is possible to hold even the people who raised you accountable under the law, and to come out the other side not bitter, not broken, but stronger and clearer about your own worth than you've ever been. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself, let me know in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more real stories of family, betrayal, and the justice that follows.